Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Taverna. I'd like to welcome you all back to the Observatory and Social Media's Awesome Speakers event. This is the second year that we're doing this, and we'll be doing a few less than we did last year, but hopefully this will, sort of emphasize the how cool the speakers are that we have this year. So just before I get started, I want to sort of introduce the Observatory for those of you who haven't come across us before. So the Observatory in Social Media is a joint project of the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering and the Media School at Indiana University. We're an interdisciplinary research group that is interested in all things at the intersection of media and technology with a focus on social media. We conduct rigorous academic research, build analytical tools and software for both scientists and journalists, and work to educate the next generation of computationally skilled media professionals. We encourage you to visit our website to learn more about our latest research papers, tools, or really anything else going on with the observatory. You can see the link there at the bottom, osome.iu.edu. And as part of the sort of general interdisciplinary mission, we've organized the Awesome Speakers virtual event, which consists basically of a series of talks from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how social media, the internet, and technology impact the world. So, we try to record these. Today's talk will be recorded as well. So if you're interested in the talk that we have today, I would encourage you to sort of visit the event page, which is linked there at the bottom. You'll be able to access some of the previously recorded talks, as well as sort of see what we have lined up for future talks this year. And we'll be adding more as the year goes on. So with that, it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joe Lukito. Dr. Lukito is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin School of Journalism and Media and the director of the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative. Joe's work uses computational and machine learning approaches to study political language with a focus on harmful digital content and multi-platform discursive flows. She also studies data access for researchers and journalists, and her work has been published in top-tier journals such as Political Communication and Social Media and Society, featured in Wired, Columbia Journalism Review, and Reuters. So as always, I'm very excited to pass things off, but I'll just sort of quickly remind everybody of the structure that we typically adopt here, which is that Joe will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some sort of open questions at the end. You can, if you like, leave questions in the chat for us to ask, but we do encourage the sort of open discussion here. It's one of the nice features about the Zoom. Anybody can kind of jump in from all over the world. And yeah, with that, I'll sort of pass things off to Joe and stop sharing. Please, if you wouldn't mind, put your hands together, your Zoom hands, and welcome Joe as she sort of gets things ready.
Hi, folks. Thanks for taking the time out of what I imagine is a very, very busy time for everyone, given that we are within the month, a month and a week before the upcoming 2024 US presidential election. So I appreciate you taking your time to chat with me about multi-platform research and election studies, a deeply timely topic for multiple reasons. If you're not familiar with me and my work, Matt has very kindly provided an introduction, but for some additional clarification, a lot of the work that I study, or a lot of the work that I do is really focused on looking at harmful political language broadly, inclusive of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, targets or forms of harassment, pro-violence discourse, support for violence discourse, and conspiracy theories. I do a lot of this work in a cross-platform or multi-platform dynamic. So oftentimes the studies that I do are either comparing between different social media platforms, like the paper that I'll be talking about today, or it's studies looking at how content or information flows from one platform to another. Perhaps no surprise to folks here because I have done misinformation and disinformation work. My work more recently has transitioned into looking at right-wing extremism, support for violence, and QAnon-type conspiracy theories. To do this work, I rely on a variety of methods, primarily computational and quantitative data collection and analytical methods, as well as more traditional qualitative and quantitative textual analysis. I think the reason why I got into multi-platform research is probably quite similar to folks here at OSoMe and others who do multi-platform research, which is to say, I think we're recognizing as a field that there's an increasing number of social media platforms that people are using. And yet, the work that we do tends to be heavily skewed towards a small number of platforms, primarily Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Reddit. And this is because of data access, right? We study the platforms that we have data access to. Ergo, the majority of our papers are not necessarily based on the popularity of the platform, but they're based on how much data can we as researchers get. And I think, with the loss of various forms of data access, including from the Twitter 2.0 API, as well as CrowdTangle, obviously these are, data application procedures that I'm sad have gone away. But the silver lining, at least for me, has been the possibility that researchers will explore and consider other social media platforms to study. To do this work, I spend a little bit of time theorizing on the social media environment as a whole. I have an under review piece with Yini Zhang and Jiyun Suk, where we talk about this multi-level social media environment framework. And it's important to recognize that when we look at this media environment, or when we look at the social media environment, it's very, very fragmented. It consists of multiple platforms. There's a lot of good work recently on the role of platformization and its impact on content. And with the rise of this fragmentation, or the explosion of social media platforms, we see the rise of these niche platforms. So platforms that are perhaps not geared towards the mainstream, but geared towards specific communities and groups, including alt-tech and right-wing based platforms. Folks might be familiar with Truth Social, which is Donald Trump's social media platform, as well as Parler, Gab, and Getter. These are all examples of alt-tech platforms. And then importantly, some of the work that I do looks at how this social media environment is connected to both news media as well as everyday life and offline communication. To do this sort of work, I rely on an infrastructure, a human and a technical infrastructure that is in deep collaboration with lots of other folks. And a big part of my research is that teamwork makes the dream work. So many of the papers that I do are collaborative in nature. I strongly believe that collaborative research is critical for political communication research moving forward, and is the kind of standard when it comes to computational social science research. Collaborative research builds in robustness checks as you have multiple people looking at a particular paper or an analysis. It facilitates specialization. And in general, I think it's just a lot more fun to do collaborative research with folks. And a lot of my favorite collaborators are those from my graduate cohort who have moved on to other institutions and communities. Another major collaborator or collaboration source of mine is the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative. And this is an initiative that I began while I was here at the University of Texas at Austin. It is this data cooperative is a way for researchers across these institutions you see here to share data with one another in a kind of formal research infrastructure way. And so in addition to doing academic research together, we maintain a data library that any of the researchers in our data cooperative can access. This data library consists of a variety of forms of content, including some that you might be familiar with already, including standard bearers like Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as alt-tech platforms such as Rumble, Getter, Truth Social, and 4chan. In addition to this social media data, we often supplement it with other forms of political data that different research centers have collected. So for example, Stanford University has access to the L2 voter roll data, and occasionally they make that available to data co-op members. Similarly, a research team at NYU, Center for Social Media and Politics, has collected a lot of FEC or Federal Elections Committee data. And so we make that available to MDDC members who sign a data use agreement. This gives us a lot of opportunities from this data library to do research together. And so the project that I'll be talking about takes a kind of sliver of our data library, a subset, looking specifically at the 2022 US midterm elections. To do this sort of analysis, we collect data from October 1st to December 31st, 2022. And we have two general parameters that we use in order to collect this data. So we have a user-based collection and a keyword-based collection. Our user-based collection focuses on congressional candidates running for office, as well as a list of news organizations and their social media handles across 8 different social media platforms. We also conduct a keyword analysis with 3 groups of keywords. Some are midterm specific keywords, terms like Biden or Trump, or 2022 midterm elections or 2022 elections. However, because of our interest in mis and disinformation, we do have additional analysis or additional collections looking specifically at election fraud terms, as well as QAnon related terms. Of course, there's a bunch of papers that can be written off a data set like that. So what I'm going to talk about today is a portion of that, kind of a sliver of this data, looking specifically at the 2022 midterm candidates. And I'll note that this paper was presented at ICA this past year, and it's currently under review in Social Media and Society. For this particular paper, we were really interested in looking at political candidates for a couple of different reasons. First, political candidates are considered public figures, ergo, we should have a right to look at this content. I think all citizens in the United States should have access to what their candidates and what their politicians are saying on social media. The past literature in political communication notes that these campaigns are not necessarily relying on just one or two social media platforms, but increasingly they're relying on a variety of different platforms because these platforms provide different affordances and reach different audiences. And one of the things we're really curious about is whether candidates use different communication strategies in different platforms. In other words, is a candidate saying something differently on Truth Social or Rumble compared to what they're saying on YouTube or Facebook? And in this particular analysis, we study a couple of different platforms, but the distinction we're most interested in is the one between alt tech platforms and mainstream platforms. And so we speculate that there is some difference in how candidates who use both types use something like Getter versus something like Twitter. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here at OSoMe, especially because there are folks at OSoMe who have done work on the 2022 midterm elections. And so I hope I am in strong agreement when I say a multi-platform collection is absolutely necessary to study a political campaign. I think we need to move past the point we were doing single platform studies of elections because that is not where users are and that's not where candidates are anymore. For this specific collection, we look at 8 different social media platforms. I listed 11 here because this is inclusive of all of the collections that we did for 2022. And the things that I note in red are the platforms that I know OSoMe has also collected. In addition to those 5, Twitter, 4chan, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit, you'll notice that one of the things that we do is collect some of the more alt tech platforms like Telegram, Truth Social, Rumble, and Getter. In this particular project, we were also interested in building an infrastructure pipeline for collecting video-based data. And so we also collected YouTube and TikTok, took the videos, used speech-to-text recognition, Whisper, and then pulled transcriptions for them. The platforms themselves vary a lot in terms of what you can collect, whether they have streaming collections, and then whether you can query by keywords or key actors. So for example, you can in theory collect by keyword on Truth Social, but you will hit a very fast rate limit. And so it tends to be more optimal for Truth Social or platforms like Rumble and Getter to collect by key actors compared to collecting by keywords. This is a bit different from platforms like 4chan and Telegram, wherein there are very few like actual user accounts. 4chan, as folks may know, tends to be more anonymous in nature. And so for some platforms, a keyword-based approach is more optimal. And I'd be happy to talk about that in Q&A. To look at this data more specifically, so keeping in mind the collection we're looking at are 2022 US congressional candidates posting between October 1st and December 1st, 2022 on 8 different social media platforms, Twitter, Truth Social, Rumble, Getter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. For this content in particular, we were really interested in campaign mobilization, and a lot of the literature in political communication on campaign mobilization has really focused on voting in particular, like does some sort of media engagement motivate voting? However, we know realistically that candidates use a variety of different strategies and are actually trying to mobilize across a variety of topics or goals. That includes things like rallies and events. Candidates often want people to attend rallies and events, as we know between the Harris and Trump debate. Candidates have mobilized around boycotts and boycotts, things like fundraising, voting, engaging with digital content, asking people to like or retweet or share something, or looking up digital evidence. And this looking up digital evidence is particularly common across the kind of alt tech community. So kind of building on this past literature on both campaign and social movements mobilization, we posed a couple of hypotheses and research questions. The first being, to what extent do candidates across different parties use different social media platforms? And more specifically, we suspect that candidates who deny or are skeptical of the 2020 US presidential election are more likely to use alt-tech platforms than those who are not. In addition to these questions about which candidates are on which platforms, we have additional questions related to how candidates perhaps use different mobilization strategies differently. So to kind of summarize our first research question, we looked at whether Democrats or Republicans were on a given platform, and perhaps no surprise to anybody here, there were no Democrats that were on an alt-tech platform. So keeping in mind this was in 2022, there were no Democrats at the time on Rumble, Getter, and Truth Social. Since then, in 2023 and 2024, Joe Biden joined Truth Social. And so we technically have an N of 1 for 2024. Some other key things to note, Democrats and Republicans appear to use mainstream platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at relatively even rates. And for a platform like TikTok, Democrats in general tend to use that platform more than Republicans. I don't know if it's possible to do a sort of Q&A thing, but I'd love to see if anyone can guess which candidate in our data set happened to have the most social media accounts.
Yeah, people should jump in if they want. Go ahead.
Too nervous to be wrong? Oh, I see something in chat. So Trump was not a political candidate. He did not run for office in the 2022 midterm elections. That is a good guess. AOC is another good guess. She's not on alt tech platforms, and so I think that kind of penalizes Democrats. I'll give it away. It was Lauren Boebert, which perhaps is not the most surprising thing for folks. I alluded to this previously, but because we're considering these sort of alt-tech platforms, candidates such as AOC or other Democrats who are really active across platforms like Instagram or YouTube are not going to be on platforms such as Rumble, Getter, or Truth Social. And one of the things that you'll notice when it comes to Lauren Boebert is that she's present. Basically, if there's a social media platform that she can be on, she is present on that platform. And that includes platforms like Telegram, where there are far, far fewer candidates on that given platform. When we look at our hypothesis, one of our first hypotheses was looking at a distinction between election skeptics and kind of Republicans on a whole. And I noted that given that there were no Democrats in our data set, we're in this particular hypothesis looking just at Republicans who denied the election or are skeptical of the 2020 election, and Republicans who have never expressed any skepticism about the 2020 election. And on a whole, we do find that very few people, thankfully, are on these alt-tech platforms. Even among Republicans, there's less than a 20% adoption rate. And there are many individuals many Republicans who have signed up for an account, but are not actually posting. And so this table here is an illustration of candidates that are actually posting on a given platform, Rumble, Getter, or Truth Social. And again, no surprise here, we find that election skeptics are posting more frequently or are active more frequently on Rumble, Getter, and Truth Social compared to their non-election skeptic counterparts. Okay, so I'm moving on from asking that first question, which candidates are on which platform, to now asking about mobilization strategies. And I mentioned previously that there's a whole slew of literature in social movements and campaign literature looking at how political campaigns mobilize voters. From this kind of broad body of literature, we narrowed it down to 5 different types of mobilization strategies. And we did this because they're either theory grounded or because they're present in our data. So for example, as we were qualitatively going through the data, we could not find examples of boycott or boycott calls for action, or we could not find a lot of people advocating for kind of do your own research. So we removed these from our code book. This left us with 5 mobilization strategies: fundraising, voting, event/rallies, so kind of compelling you to attend an event or a rally, digital engagement, which we describe as encouraging people to like, share, retweet, or engage in some sort of behavior like that. And then visiting other platforms. So when you are telling someone to click a link and go to a different social media platform specifically. The example you see on the right-hand side is an example of a fundraising call for action. So we're 8 days away from the start of early voting and we're under attack. We've seen examples of fundraising efforts, particularly in terms of emails, but I think fundraising efforts as mobilization tends to be understudied in social media campaign literature. And then one thing that we've kind of siphoned off from our overall analysis is discourse about election fraud. And I'd be super curious to see if folks here are doing similar research on election fraud or election skepticism, just because I'd be happy, like I'd love to chat with folks about it and think about points of collaboration. When we look at their overall mobilization strategies, we do find perhaps some variation across the different social media platforms. And so this is with all of the Democrats and Republicans aggregated. One of the things that you'll notice is that YouTube is strongly used for efforts such as events and rallies, which would make sense, right? When a candidate is trying to compel people to attend an event or rally, they might post a previous version or a previous video of their event or rally to do so. Similarly, we find that platforms such as Facebook and Instagram are really strong for voting efforts. These are platforms where it's fairly easy to post a picture, an image, or some text that encourages people to get out the vote. By comparison, platforms in the alt tech space, Getter seemed to be a platform that was very much used for getting people to like, share, or engage in some way, shape, or form. Getter was also a very popular platform for, again, mobilizing voters. Again, no surprise here. We also find that when we look at election disbelief or election fraud discourse, that much more of it is present on alt tech platforms compared to mainstream platforms. Expanding on this analysis a little bit further, we wanted to conduct an OLS regression by candidate platform and time period, where we're looking at the proportion of candidates' posts on a platform that is using some sort of mobilization strategy. So that's our dependent variable. And we speculate that this DV is affected by the platform that a person is on, the competitiveness of the race, whether the candidate is an election denier, and then we separate the estimates by before and after the election, so October 1st to November 4th, and then November 6th to December 1st. So incoming plots here. This first plot looks at pre and post candidates. So that's what you see, the coefficients reported on the left and the right. And then top to bottom are the Democrats and Republicans with mobilization strategies indicated in slightly different colors. You'll notice that coefficients that are statistically significant are in a triangle, whereas coefficients that are not statistically significant are in dots. Additionally, the referent category here is Facebook. And so when you're interpreting a result like this, pre-election Democrats are less likely to use YouTube compared to Facebook. Some of the key things to point out here is that we actually didn't see much difference between Democrats and Republicans, but we do see a fair amount of difference between different platforms that are used. So for example, both Democrats and Republicans were more likely to use Instagram to encourage people to go to other platforms than they are to use Facebook to do so. Similarly, we find that in the post-election period, so after the election, YouTube is actually used a lot for election voting related discussion as well as event related discussion. We speculate that this result here is likely because of election fraud related discourse. If there are people who are upset about their election, they're likely to still engage in kind of voting related discourse, whereas we don't necessarily expect them to talk about that as much in the pre-election period. And then we look specifically at alt tech platforms, keeping in mind, again, that Democrats are not on these alt tech platforms, Getter, Rumble, and Truth Social. And so for this analysis, we only look at Republicans on Getter, Rumble, and Truth Social. And what we find here is that Truth Social, and again, this is still compared to Facebook. Truth Social is used actually more for motivating people to go to other platforms such as Getter and Rumble. We also find a lot of references of Truth Social pointing to Telegram and Parler compared to Facebook and other sorts of platforms. So in kind of summary, some key points that we find in this analysis. No Democratic candidates in our data set were on an alt tech platform, although I alluded to the fact that Democratic candidates now are on alt tech platforms, and specifically Truth Social. We also find that non-election denial Republicans were less likely to use alt tech platforms compared to their election denial candidates. Furthermore, we find that there are more commonalities across parties. So Democrats and Republicans were actually likely to use these platforms similarly. However, we do find a fair bit of platform variation where YouTube was used for some mobilizing strategies more than those mobilizing strategies were used on Facebook. And we speculate that this is likely the case because of modality. So given that YouTube, Rumble, and TikTok in particular are video or audio-video based platforms, we expect that they can encourage different mobilization strategies compared to text-based platforms such as Truth Social or Twitter. And then kind of building off of that, we found that Democrat and Republican candidates did use mobilizing efforts more on YouTube relative to Facebook. So with kind of all of that work, we conducted this analysis at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023. And of course, as we were thinking about 2024, we were like, we would really like to replicate some sort of analysis, perhaps even consider more platforms. Certainly one of the big things we wanted to do was to extend the time frame that we had, going not just from October 1st to December 31st, but expanding it to kind of July 2024 to December 2024. And at the time, of course, we were looking at Biden and Trump as candidates in 2024. Now we're looking at Harris and Trump now that we're a month into the election. Again, no surprise to anyone here. Because of that, we have lost in kind of the span of doing this work from 2023 till now, we have lost a ton of data access, most notably in the form of the loss of the Twitter 2.0 academic track API. However, we've also lost access to PushShift now that Reddit has closed it, and the Reddit API is much more limited in that respect. And then, of course, the loss of CrowdTangle several months ago has had a significant effect on people's ability to study social media, Facebook and Instagram in particular. And so some of the work that I've been doing on more of my data access side for academic researchers and journalists have been surveying researchers who formerly had access to Twitter data or who are trying to apply for access under the Digital Services Act, under the DSA in Europe. One of the things that we have found in conducting these sort of surveys and interviews with researchers is that researchers either are not aware that they can apply for access, or these access regimes are really, really work prohibitive, which is to say they require a lot of paperwork, they require authorization signatory, or some sort of contractual agreement, which makes it really hard for academic researchers to actually have access to these platforms. Which is to say, some platforms such as Twitter or Pinterest can provide a data access program or some sort of application process, but the work that it takes for a researcher to actually get that access can be really, really challenging. On top of that, when they get access to that particular platform, they may find that the data they're looking for is not actually available, either because there's a really strong rate limit, such as on Truth Social, or because they cannot download the content locally, such as the meta content library, or the data might not be available. So for example, Twitter now has some really cost prohibitive forms of data access. Even when you have those sort of cost prohibitive data access systems, like if you hypothetically pay for them, it's a lot more challenging to get access to follower following data that is needed to do things like network analysis. And so this piece that Megan Brown and I wrote, Megan Brown is a PhD student at the University of Michigan. She and I have collaborated a lot on data access questions. And we write this piece just highlighting the different forms of data access loss and the impact of this directly on the 2024 US elections. In addition to this, I'm doing some ongoing work with Megan Brown and then an awesome alum, Kai Cheng Yang. The three of us are doing some work in relation to the Digital Services Act, which I alluded to previously. So under the Digital Services Act, there is a clause that requires social media platforms to provide some form of data access to academic researchers. There are a lot of caveats around the DSA, and I'm happy to chat about those things. One of the caveats is that it is a European policy or a European law. And so the extent to which it applies to American researchers is still kind of a big question mark. However, even with all of those caveats, I think this is still perhaps one of the most optimistic forms of regulation that might provide data access to academic researchers. And so because of the introduction of the DSA, Megan, Kai Cheng, and I have been really curious about whether researchers are actually able to get access to data. So are they aware that they can apply for access? Is applying for access really, really challenging? Do they get accepted or rejected? And why might that be the case? And then if they get access, do they actually get the data they want? This work is still in production. We are continuing to take survey responses for folks who are conducting research or for folks who are still applying for data access. And so I encourage you to go to the Coalition for Independent Technology Research if you're willing to fill out the survey just talking about your experience applying for data access. In addition to that, we will be conducting a DSA audit. So we're collaborating with some of our survey respondents to actually systematically apply to these applications for Pinterest, TikTok, the Reddit, the kind of new Reddit for researchers program, and some other social media platforms. And so if you're interested in being involved in that auditing process, please let me know. I'd be happy to put you in touch with the team, just because I know we need a large number of folks in order to do this sort of auditing. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of my ongoing projects in collaboration with a couple of colleagues at the Algorithmic Transparency Institute, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, as well as the Social Media Archive. And so one of the things that we were trying to do is collect all the candidates' social media handles and content for the 2024 US election. And we've been conducting this collection since January. This project has been ongoing for about a year, maybe about a year and a half now. When we originally started this Candidata project, we very much assumed that we were going to be able to get some forms of data through things like CrowdTangle and other mechanisms. Of course, that is no longer possible. And so we are trying other more scraping and non-traditional strategies in order to collect this data. The goal of this data is so that journalists and academics can potentially use a data set like this. And so the release of this data is going to come in kind of three waves. First, we're going to release the social media handles for all of the candidates. That tentatively will be released on October 10th or 12th. The second release that we're doing is a set of dashboards specifically for journalists who want to do real-time or near real-time analysis for their reporting in the days upcoming to the election. And then finally, we plan to clean up, prepare, and release all of the content from the data that we're collecting in the social media archive. This mechanism will make it possible for academic researchers to use the social media data that we've collected. To kind of highlight what we're collecting, I wanted to put together this table inclusive of the platforms that we have considered previously, how we collected it in 2022 for our midterm election or midterm analysis, and then how we might be collecting it for 2024. And so, for example, one thing you'll notice is for Twitter, we had in 2022 collected it using the API. Now we are using traditional scraping means, looking at particular social media handles and then collecting all the content produced by them. Similarly, we will have to use scrapers for Facebook as well as Instagram, as well as shifting from using Reddit to collect or using PushShift to collect Reddit data to now using their more limited API in a kind of semi-streaming way to collect Reddit data. All of which is to say, it's, I think, continuing to be challenging in interesting ways to do multi-platform research, but I think we cannot give up on this sort of work. It's really, really essential if we want to talk about the social media ecosystem in a sort of holistic or complete way. We need to start collecting more social media platforms in order to do so. And with that, I just want to thank folks very much for taking the time to chat with me about data access and elections research. I am really glad to be doing elections research despite all the kind of crazy that comes along with elections. And I'd be happy to kind of answer or take any questions at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joe. That was awesome. At this point, I've removed the spotlight. We'll open up the floor for everybody to ask questions. Obviously, Joe talked about a lot there, so please don't be shy. And if you have any questions, you can raise your hand in Zoom and we'll sort of knock them down the list. And if people are feeling shy, okay, Kai Cheng will go. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Joe. Hi, everyone.
Good to
Sorry.
see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. I had another meeting running longer than. But a very cool study on the cross-platform analysis of the politicians. I, I, I have a question more about the data release you're
Yeah.
talking about, right? So first
Mhm.
of all, do you have a link for the candidate data 2024 project? I was trying to search for it, but I couldn't find it somehow.
Yeah, we have a soft link. I'd be happy to share it with you kind of interpersonally. We're hoping to release it on the 10th,
Oh, I
maybe the
see. Yeah.
12th. And so we're doing some kind of final validations of the handles as well as just finalizing the dashboards. But I'm happy to share a link once the
No, no, don't
project is
worry.
like out.
I'll just wait. I saw it was already out there somewhere. That I didn't know which.
We had fully intended it to come out on October 1st, and then October
Yeah.
1st came and passed and was like, we've lost our minds. So we're hoping to release it next week.
Yeah, thank you. A related question is, I want to hear your take on, how to release those data in a, ethical and also in an ethical way, but also like permitted by the law, for
Yeah.
example, or that wouldn't get researchers into trouble because we actually had similar discussions very
Yeah.
recently where as you mentioned, we do have, for example, the 2022 data collection where we have been constantly getting requests to access data, but we couldn't.
Totally.
And maybe Phil and Kathleen can chime in that I think they talked to Solmar that, exploring the possibility of hosting data there. Like even that, it seems Solmar doesn't want to take the sort of legal risk or, it's just it kind of frustrating, I would say, like because we
Absolutely.
feel like we have those valuable data, but we couldn't really share that with other researchers. So it seems you figure out a way to do it, or maybe it's because it's for the politicians, so it's a different category. So, but either way, I do want to hear like what you think and what would be your recommended practice in this regard.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question because this is something that we constantly struggle with is like, how do we provide the data that we've collected? And you're 100% right that we focus specifically on politicians, which at least for 2024, which makes it a lot easier to share that data because they're public figures. It also makes it a lot easier to make the argument that we can or should scrape their data because their content is, to me, a matter of, a public right. That's something that all citizens, all residents in the US should have access to. When we look at other data sets that the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative have handled, so for example, keyword-based searches in the 2022 election, we also have an ongoing data set where we've collected a lot of QAnon content formerly from Twitter. 70% of that content has now been deleted. And so even if we share the tweet IDs, no one can reconstruct that data. The best way that we have maybe best is not the right way to put it. The way that we've found that we're able to share the data is either doing some sort of data available on request or some sort of more formalized procedure for someone to request the data, and then having them sign a data use agreement that acknowledges, one, that they've received the data, that they are aware that there are deletion processes, and it forces them to inform us what project that they're conducting with the data that we're going to share with them. It's somewhere in between kind of just blanket sharing it to everyone, which we've seen some research teams do, and kind of somewhere between that and then just informally emailing someone the data. So at least we have a record of who we've shared it with.
So
We're,
sorry, Joe, to interrupt.
yeah, please.
Regarding the data use agreement, are you doing that, like application reviewing process yourself, or you are sort of using, for example, SOMar to do that? I
Yeah,
think it's really important, right? Because if you do it yourself, it become a
it's
task.
time consuming. Yeah,
Yeah,
we are currently doing it ourselves. One of the things we're trying to work with SOMAR, so they have this thing called I think it's like a researcher passport. And so the idea behind it is that using your ORCID number, you would be able to register as someone who is an academic researcher. And we're trying to get a grant with SOMAR right now to see if we can apply that kind of passport system they have to our data library. Because one of the challenges for sure that we've had has been having to address each of these data use agreements individually.
yeah,
Additionally, on top of that, one of the things that we've seen is even when we have the data use agreement, there's a question of what do we ultimately share with them? And there's been a lot of kind of competing or strong disagreements about this in particular. We tend to take the approach that we will remove their handles if they are under a certain amount of followers. So if they have fewer than 10,000 followers, we hash the ID of the user account or we remove the screen name. I'll occasionally get pushback from ethicists about this because you can just as easily take like a tweet or a Facebook post, go on Google and search the content
yeah.
itself. And so it's not like fully anonymized. And I acknowledge that. Like I accept that as a limitation of the process that we're doing. I still think it's much more important to have the raw content or the raw text than it is to like paraphrase it using GPT or some other LLM. And so I'm willing to take on that sort of risk, but I do acknowledge that because a lot of ethicists have brought that up. Oh gosh, there was something else I was going to mention in relation to this, but the last thing that I'll note is that at least among our data cooperative, one of the strongest ways in which we're able to get research centers to share data with each other is that we put together a memorandum of understanding, which tends to have a stronger contractual agreement. It required authorized signatory for all the research centers that I mentioned previously. There are currently 7 research centers that are a part of that memorandum of understanding. That took 2.5 years to put together because of how much legal conversation we had to have. And so even collaborations among research teams, we just don't have a lot of academic infrastructure to figure out like how do you do a joint IRB on this? How do you make sure that you have some sort of contractual approval so that researchers can share carte blanche whatever data they want with their actual collaborators in another institution? And that's, I think, an ongoing challenge that social media researchers definitely have.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much. That was very helpful.
Yeah, and if you're interested in like the data use agreement type stuff, CSMAP, CIP, and MDDC all have data use agreements. I'd be happy to share like templates of those, just so that if you're interested in like how do I model off of one, you'll have a couple of examples.
Sorry, just a very quick follow-up. Do you think it would be helpful, for example, if I don't know, like share those kind of things as a, recommended practice so that because, if everybody try to write their own data use agreement, that would be it's just difficult, right? It's not
A hundred
most
percent.
researchers are familiar with. Just a random thought.
Yeah, so the two things that we were like, oh, we should make kind of templates for this that's accessible to people are the data use agreement and then a job call for a data engineer, because we find that people like teams who work on these sort of large data collection processes tend to hire some sort of data engineer or data librarian in order to do so. And we are also reinventing the wheel on what's needed to have a data engineer. Or there are a lot of teams like Clemson University that hired their first data engineer but didn't necessarily know what skills to ask for. And so we've been like on and off talking about having some sort of template DUA or template job call. Now that you mentioned it, I'm going to put it higher on my to-do list.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things that's kind of amazing about the talk is you've gone through so many different sort of resources and things that the community can use, and it's all really wonderful to try to help, I guess, whoever is here. Is there one place, like, or one website that you would point us to, so that people can sort of explore further?
Yeah, let's see. I'll share the link to my to the Median Democracy Data Cooperative. It is, as I mentioned, a very much kind of on the grounds, horizontally structured group. And the goal of it is to share data with each other as well as to collaborate on academic research together. And so if you're interested in joining either as like OSoMe or as individual researchers, please feel free to reach out. We can talk about how you would be able to join an MOU. I will note it takes about 6 months for a new member to join the Memorandum of Understanding, just because we end up talking with a lot of your legal counsel. And then it provides a little bit of information about some of our ongoing or past work, which you'll note is very much multi-platform in many ways.
Awesome. Thank you.
Can you guys hear us? You're in the room?
Yep. Go ahead, Phil.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for speaking to us today.
Hi, Phil.
So I was just following up on what you said and also what Kevin asked about the legal hurdles.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you guys are now scraping from Twitter. So I think, I don't know if you guys are aware, we are just learning that Twitter is changing their terms of service to make it much more difficult for researchers to use their data. They're adding limitations to how to share the data beyond what we already had, the difficulty of rehydrating or using the API because of financial hurdles. But now they're adding legal hurdles saying, for example, that no research can be done on Twitter data without the written consent.
Yeah.
An example. And so clearly universities are going to have different levels of concerns depending on their legal philosophies on how to weigh the legal risks of violating terms versus the the duties that we have as researchers to report our research and to analyze data. And yeah, so that's what Kevin was alluding earlier, that the conversations that we had with SOMAR indicated that that was a level of risk that they were not willing to take.
Yeah.
We have, we were exploring the possibilities of sharing some of our data broadly, with making it easier to share data with the community. And now that's very hard for us, and we're trying to find the right balance or the right line in this very big gray area that is generated by these changing terms. So yeah, in light of all that, your memorandum of understandings, your decision to scrape data and to make this data available upon request with some anonymization level, as you were describing. I mean, it is a very complex situation with a lot of hurdles and risks that you are taking. You are taking some level of risks on yourself.
Absolutely.
You're taking some level of risk on ourselves. So more broadly, like, going up a little bit, like where do you think is the right level of, where is the right line in the sand? Are we obliged to do research, or is it safe to just do less and less because either the risks are too high or the administrative burden of managing these collaborations is getting too high? What's your general philosophical approach?
That's such a great question, Phil. And I appreciate you asking from kind of like a eyes view or like kind of a bigger picture, because oftentimes when I do these presentations, we so focus on the nitty gritty, like what classifier did you use to create this model? And we don't really talk about the implications of these legal frameworks or what's going on in current events that's directly impacting our day-to-day research. And so for me, when I think about potential risks, I imagine that academic research can have 3 areas of risk. You take on risk when you're collecting data. This is the question of like API versus scraping versus, asking users to donate data. You can take on risk by the kind of analysis that you do, particularly if the analysis that you do like ends up identifying people or causes potential harm. And then the third area is that you introduce risk when you decide to share data. So if you choose not to share data, then you're not taking on the risk of sharing it. But I strongly believe in ethical and responsible open science. So I think we need to find ways in order to share data with each other. Phil, I think you're 100% in noting, or 100% correct in noting, that we currently do not have infrastructure to do this in a systematic or responsible way. which is to say the reason why this becomes really hard to do is because we don't have kind of a set of protocols for how do we collect the data, what's the legal framework for doing so, how do we share the data, and what's the legal framework for doing so. And so first and foremost, that's the one thing I would really like to see that would make my life easier, is if the US had some sort of DSA-like thing, and that sort of implementation was much more systematic than asking platforms to be in good faith to share data with certain researchers under some sort of grant-related process. So I think the piecemealness of it, the fact that we have to think about the legal ramifications or the risks for each individual platform, makes it really hard because we have to treat each individual platform differently, or we have to treat these sort of collaborations differently. I am optimistic that this is going to change. So that's, one of the big reasons that I do my data cooperative work, is so that other researchers can build their own data cooperatives. It's not just about having everyone fall under the Media and Democracy Data Cooperative, but to Kai Cheng's point, how do we make sure that the DSA that we use or the MOU we use can become templates for the future? And so that's where I see a lot of my work going, is not just in doing academic research, but in doing more of a kind of meta research. How do we do research about research? In the area of scraping in particular, and I wanted to note this because of the 2024 election stuff, and also because I imagine you were also thinking about data scraping. Under technically, I think it's High 9 v. LinkedIn. I'm trying to remember the exact case law, but that was one of the very first lawsuits about data scraping. There was a team, a non-academic team, that was scraping a bunch of LinkedIn data. HiQ versus LinkedIn is the name of the case law. They found that scraping data was not considered a Computer Frauds and Abuse Act violation. That was the very first case law about it. Since then, because Elon Musk has been so litigious, he has attempted to sue several other researchers in trying to who are trying to scrape data in some way, shape, or form. Musk has been not as successful in terms of scraping that data, or in terms of successfully proceeding with those lawsuits. So that gives us a little bit of, I think, confidence in the idea that even if what we're doing is risky or invites litigation, we would be winning such a case. Related to this, I put a couple of links here in the chat to the Knight First Amendment Institute, because when we were making these legal risks decisions, or we were trying to make these kind of data sharing decisions, one group that we continue to go to is the Knight First Amendment Institute. And the Knight First Amendment Institute is supported by the Knight Foundation. The director who leads it is Alex Abdo. He does do office hours, and he talks to academic researchers specifically about data sharing risks. So if you have a data set that you want to share, what are the legal risks of sharing it? Or if you're doing some sort of scraping project, what are the potential risks incurred if you are doing a project like that? And so they've been really helpful. Every time we have a data set we're thinking of sharing, we end up talking to them about, what we've tried to do in terms of sharing it, what's possible and what's not possible. So I'll give 3 really concrete examples of this. There's one data set that we wanted to share. When we approached them about the 2022 candidates data, they mentioned that this was easier to share more publicly because it was it was campaign candidates and public platforms, that sort of thing. The second data set, we were collecting a bunch of QAnon content. I mentioned 70% of it has been deleted. We approached SOMAR to share the data to see if they would be willing to take the data, and they were not willing to take the data. So we went to the Knight First Amendment Institute and asked them, what's the kind of best approach forward? And between the Knight First Amendment Institute, SOMAR, and MDDC, one possibility or one way that we figured we could do it was to have SOMAR mention it in their kind of archive. So they list it as a potential source. But in order to actually access the data, MDDC would serve as a data janitor. So we take on the risk of evaluating the data use agreements and things like that, but it still gets to be listed on SOMAR. The last, perhaps least optimistic case that I have, there's a data set that we really wanted to release of Alex Jones's transcripts. So MDDC collected 2 decades worth of Alex Jones recordings. For those who not know, Alex Jones does a 4-hour audio show every day from Monday through Thursday, and a 2-hour show on Friday. It's a lot of content. And so we transcribed all the content using Google speech to text and Whisper. We compared that analysis. That paper was accepted in Media and Communication. We wanted to make that data set available But when we talked to Alex Abdo about it, we realized that we would need to get Alex Jones's permission to share that data. And so kind of tragically, similar to what you were mentioning, Phil, like that has been one real point of frustration is we want to make that data set available to researchers because there's so much audio data in there. It's one of the few data sets where you have really extensive audio and transcript information. We also ran a bunch of computational phonology on it, and we want to share that data. But because of the legal risks of it, we still have not found a way to effectively share that data to more people.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry, that's not an optimistic example to end on, but
it's very, very helpful, both the big picture things and the specific cases and the advice about the Knight First Amendment Institute. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I do think it's it gets better when we work together. And so I was really excited when I was invited to do an OSoMe talk because I know a lot of you are doing very similar work, extensively looking at multiple social media platforms. And I guarantee you are encountering very similar challenges, if not the same challenges to us.
Indeed, we are.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we are running into the end of the meeting here, but if I could just ask one more question that I'm curious about how you think about sort of the sort of multi-platform landscape. So I mean, as we've discussed sort of ad nauseum here, we sort of have to hack our way around the different kinds of options to get different kinds of data. And one of the things that I think about a lot is like, given the limitations that are there, we can only get access to sort of certain kinds of data.
Yeah.
So how do you think about different kinds of comparative analyses? So for example, with TikTok, I think you mentioned that you're focusing on like key accounts because that's like only the real way you can access that data.
Yeah.
So as a result, you don't have a good sample of kind of like the whole space, but you have a good coverage of these users. And then if you want to compare those to, so there's all these different weird ways of thinking about kind of the sample of data that you have. And then, to me, it looks kind of like, okay, we sort of have a lot of access. There's whatever 8 to 10 different platforms that you were to discuss you have data for, but how blinded are we by sort of the lens that we get into these platforms? And so I'm sort of rambling on about a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
Hopefully you can get an idea of the sense of the question and maybe
100%.
share your thoughts on that aspect. I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah. And I also just saw Amanda had a comment about using Junkipedia. 1010 Junkipedia is awesome. I love Cameron Hickey. He's such a great data collector. And I'd be happy to like chat about those things if you're interested in the future, Amanda. To go back to your point, Matt, in terms of like how much can we collect and where we're getting it from? I think there's like a theory component to this and then the actual technical method stuff. So I'll start with the method stuff because it's a little bit easier. The answer is no. Like we definitely don't get everything we want from a social media platform. And we oftentimes don't know the representativeness of the sample that we're collecting from. I think this is why we end up having a lot of keyword-based collections, like studies and user-based studies is for this reason. Like there's not really an effective way to take a representative sample of Twitter or YouTube or so on and so forth. I know Matt Heineman is doing a little bit of work at IDDP on this area of like, what is a quote unquote representative sample of YouTube. And he makes this argument that if you take a cut of the quote unquote top of the ocean, like the most popular content or the most popular users, you can get a large or representatively large portion of the platform. The question of whether that would apply across multiple platforms, like if it works for YouTube, does the same math work for Facebook or Instagram or TikTok? Like that's the bigger question I think he's in the process of trying to answer now. And it parallels a lot of similar challenges to like, how do you compare engagement across different social media platforms? So I 100% think that's still like an open question, especially because we haven't really done a lot of work on the theory side in terms of typologizing platforms. So going to that kind of first part in terms of theory building, one of the pieces that I mentioned I'm doing certain kind of work on right now is trying to theorize what a social media ecosystem framework looks like and how can we use this framework to study the media ecology. To do this sort of work, one kind of dimension or layer of analysis that we've been talking about is what we call the social media space. And I'll share my screen very, very briefly. This is from one of my earlier slides. I mentioned this is a piece that's currently under review with Yin Zhang and Ji Suk. We talk about the social media ecosystem as this sort of multi-layered system. And the one layer that we introduce is called the social media space. And so within one social media platform, we argue that there are multiple spaces within that platform. So for example, if you're on Twitter and you're tweeting something or posting something versus using a direct message, those are two different spaces, one that's perhaps more public and one that's more private. So we can say that the analysis we're looking at is at the space level public. We're not looking at the whole platform. We're looking at the public space on that platform. Another really concrete example of this is Facebook, right? Facebook has a lot of different spaces. You have direct messages, you have secret groups, you have closed groups, open groups, timelines, public pages, public groups. And so when we talk about Facebook, we don't actually study Facebook, the platform as a whole. We're studying spaces on that platform. Public spaces, public pages, groups, so on and so forth. And so from a theory perspective, one of the things we're hoping to do is like introduce this kind of social media space argument so that we're not just saying like, we do this study of Twitter, we're studying Twitter as a platform. The other way in which we're doing theory building right now is with a special issue. So there's a couple of colleagues in Media and Democracy Data Cooperative who are special issue editors for a special issue in political communication on multi-platform dynamics. That special issue, perhaps no surprise to anyone, is like still very much in process. And so we started soliciting papers for that last year. We're currently in the like R&R process with a lot of these papers, and we're hoping to have that special issue come out in 2025. For that special issue in particular, we're really hoping to push people on theorizing. We spend a lot of time doing these sort of studies across platforms or between platforms or, you know, multi-platform studies, but we don't have a lot of theory on it, right? We don't have a lot of theorizing on like why might content flow from one platform to another, or why might content be different across different modalities. And so we're hoping that that piece or that special issue speaks a little bit more theoretically to that. And hopefully with more theory work, we can start to do more robust, you know, methodological questions of like, if we wanted to answer or test this theory, what actual data do we need? Do we even need a representative sample, or do we just need case-by-case samples?
Awesome. Thank you for a very, very thorough answer. We're a few minutes over, so I'll say thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks you again, Joe, for joining us. It was a really awesome conversation. I'll quickly plug our next talk, which I believe just went on the website today, for Christina Lerman from USC. I think Caitlin mentioned it in the chat. And you can find the registration link on the event page if you go to the OSoMe website. So thank you all so much. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.